when Joshua and I were preparing to finalize our divorce. He got into a car accident and lost his memory. His memories stayed stuck 8 years in the past. 8 years ago. That was when he loved me the most. Chapter 1. Joshua stared deeply at me, his gaze heavy. He asked, "Alice, be honest with me. Do you want a divorce because you've fallen in love with someone else?" I sighed tiredly and remained silent under his questioning. He had forgotten. The one who had been desperately trying to get a divorce wasn't me. The one who had fallen in love with someone else wasn't me. It was him. But Joshua couldn't believe he would ever fall for someone else. He sat on the hospital bed, looking at me as if he had just heard some ridiculous, absurd joke. His gaze shifted from Eric beside me back to me. Then he let out a cold laugh and asked, "Are you two conspiring to deceive me?" Joshua had been in a car accident. The blood clot in his brain was pressing against surrounding nerves, causing temporary memory loss. He had forgotten everything that had happened in the past 8 years. 8 years ago, we had just graduated. I stood by him through the tough times, starting a business together, and at that time, he was entirely devoted to me. Telling that Joshua he would one day fall for someone else? He wouldn't believe it, and neither would the version of me from 8 years ago. Chapter 2. Rebecca, sitting next to him, tearfully reached out to hold his hand, but he pulled away, his brows furrowed in restrained frustration, and in an icy tone, he said to Rebecca, "Stay away from me." Rebecca froze for a moment, then tears began to stream down her face. Even in her tearful state, she didn't forget to cast a vicious glare in my direction, as if I were the one responsible for all of this. The sight almost made me want to laugh, but I couldn't. Besides, Joshua and I really had nothing left to say to each other. I stood far from his hospital bed, my expression indifferent as I said coldly, "The divorce papers were drafted under your instruction by your legal team. Your lead lawyer meticulously reviewed every word before presenting them to you." I sighed. "After you're discharged, you can ask those around you if I've lied to you." Joshua looked up at me, his gaze fixed, as if my cold attitude had wounded him for the first time. I saw confusion, hesitation, and even a plea in his expression. 4 years. Joshua had been confident and certain about everything, never wavering. Such vulnerability in his eyes was something I hadn't seen in a long time. But my heart had long grown cold. No matter how lost and confused he was, it could no longer move me. After a brief pause, I turned and walked away. Chapter 3. It was a month ago when Joshua had his car accident. He probably regained consciousness just a few days ago, likely to avoid affecting the stock price of Peak Tech. His accident had been kept tightly under wraps. I imagine that if things hadn't taken a slight turn for the worse, his chief assistant wouldn't have bothered to call me to inform me about his accident. The accident happened the night I told him I wanted a divorce. But no, the crash wasn't because he was distracted by the divorce. That night, heavy rain poured down in City B. He had just finished a meeting in Florence and was rushing back to make it home before midnight for Rebecca's birthday. He ended up crashing into a large bus that had run a red light, driven by a fatigued driver. Touching, isn't it? It wasn't until after Joshua's surgery, when he regained consciousness, that his assistant called me, because Joshua's memory was stuck 8 years in the past. He didn't recognize anyone around him. 8 years ago, Rebecca hadn't entered his life yet. In his memory, there was only me. Joshua had always been smart, calm, and methodical. Even in such a chaotic situation, he quickly adapted to the current reality and caught up on the state of his company. But there was one thing he simply refused to believe. He couldn't believe that he had fallen in love with Rebecca or that he wanted to divorce me. His trusted colleagues and Rebecca provided him with all sorts of details about his life with Rebecca. But he wouldn't believe it. He insisted on seeing me, with no other options. They called me and told me about Joshua's accident. They treated me like evidence in a courtroom, displaying me in front of Joshua to prove that our relationship had long since deteriorated beyond repair. They wanted to use this to convince Joshua that this wasn't 8 years ago anymore. Time had passed, and it was now 8 years later. During those 8 forgotten years, there had been no mutual affection between us. Only mutual resentment. Whether or not he believed or accepted it was up to him. Chapter 4. The next time I saw Joshua was half a month later. He must have snuck out of the hospital, still wearing the blue-striped hospital gown, with bandages wrapped around his head, sitting haphazardly at the doorstep of my house. I hadn't seen him look so disheveled in 5 or 6 years. He was a city's rising star, always impeccably dressed in tailored suits, with trousers pressed to sharp perfection. His handsome face had grown more unreadable, and as his status rose, the sharp edges of his personality had learned to soften, becoming deep and composed. Wherever he went, people would politely greet him with, "Good day, Mr. Su." Seeing him in such a state reminded me of the last time, probably right after graduation. He heard my footsteps and abruptly looked up. At that moment, I had just picked up Sam from school. His gaze shifted from me to Sam beside me, and something flickered in his expression. His eyes focused. He had always been quick-witted and adaptable, even with 8 years of memory missing. I'm sure he could have pieced together the gist of his life from the stories others had told him. He had succeeded in his business venture. We had gotten married and had a child. He had fallen for someone else, and I had asked for a divorce. Holding Sam's hand, I stopped at a distance from him, my expression cold as I asked, "Why are you here?" He seemed to hold back for a moment, then asked, "Is he our child?" Sam wasn't very close to him, standing quietly and distantly by my side. Sam looked at Joshua, then turned his gaze to me and softly called out, "Mom." I patted his head. "Go inside and start your homework." Sam glanced at me, then at Joshua. Before giving a soft nod, he slung his backpack over his shoulder and went inside. Chapter 5. Joshua watched him until he disappeared into the house before turning back to me. His brows, tightly furrowed, hadn't relaxed the entire time. He asked, clearly confused, "I don't understand, Alice. Since college, my dream has always been to marry you and have a child. Now that dream has come true, but..." He trailed off. I knew what he didn't say, why the reality of 8 years later was so different from the vision he once had. He had gotten his wish and married me, but now I was completely indifferent to him, and even our child was distant from him. He tried hard to think and recall, but the blood clot pressing on his brain wouldn't let him. He furrowed his brows deeply, likely feeling the pain in his head flare up again. He raised his hand to rub his temples forcefully, then looked up at me, his eyes filled with sorrow, like a stray dog abandoned on the street. Genuinely bewildered, in a voice filled with pain, he asked, "Alice, I truly don't understand. How did we end up like this?" I looked over the divorce papers. Everyone says I personally instructed them to draft them, and each clause is harsh and heartless. I don't understand. Why would I want to divorce you? Why indeed? Because 8 years ago, Joshua's greatest dream was to marry me. But 8 years later, his greatest dream was to convince me to divorce him, so he could marry Rebecca and give her the title she deserved. Chapter 6. Joshua and I had a story that was all too common. We fell in love in college. He was the president of the student council and was selected to star in a campus promotional video focused on the theme of self-love, self-respect, and self-reliance. In one chapter, he played the role of a scumbag who deceived a girl. At that time, I happened to walk by the filming location, unaware they were shooting a video. I saw a girl clinging desperately to his arm, crying and begging, "I'm pregnant. Don't leave me, please." Joshua frowned and said, "Go to the hospital and get rid of it. Stop bothering me." I was so furious I marched right up to him and smeared the half-eaten ice cream in my hand all over his face. Then grabbed the girl's hand and righteously declared, "Girl, a guy like this is not worth it." The girl stopped crying, staring at me in stunned silence. Joshua wiped the ice cream off his face and, with an amused smile, turned to the equally shocked students hiding behind the trees with their cameras and said, "Yes, that's exactly the value we want to convey in the self-love chapter." I blushed furiously and apologized repeatedly, but Joshua, showing no hard feelings, waved it off as nothing. Later, I treated him to a meal to apologize, and after that, we got together. Joshua was an excellent boyfriend. We had many sweet memories together. Of course, we also fought, but every time, he was the first to apologize. There was one time, during our sophomore year, when we went hiking. For some reason, we had an argument, and Joshua, infuriated, stormed ahead, likely to avoid getting more emotional and escalating the fight. I tried to keep up, but I couldn't catch him. And soon, he was out of sight. But after climbing just a few hundred steps, I saw him standing by a crooked tree, clearly trying to suppress his anger, waiting for me. He didn't give me an easy out, struggling to keep his temper in check. He said, "Just so we're clear, I haven't cooled down yet. I'm only waiting because I didn't want you to fall behind." After graduation, many couples didn't survive the infamous breakup curse, but Joshua held my hand firmly and said we would definitely get married. After graduation, my parents had secured a great job for me back home, and I had a strong academic background, but I chose to stay with Joshua. In the early days of his startup, money was tight. We lived in a basement apartment that never saw the light of day, sharing a single plate of fried noodles between the two of us. He would always push the few slivers of meat and greens in the noodles onto my plate. He told me he wouldn't let me suffer forever. And he didn't. Things eventually started looking up. Then he met Rebecca. Time changes people, as they say. In just 8 years, he changed too quickly, so fast that I couldn't keep up. Now, he no longer worries about whether I can keep pace with him. Chapter 7. Before meeting Rebecca, I had actually heard Joshua mention her a few times. The first time her name came up, if I remember correctly, was 7 years ago. At that time, his company had just finished its Series A financing, and one night when he came home, he was excited, telling me he had hired someone exceptionally talented, a graduate from a prestigious overseas university, with a strong professional background, capable and with her own insights. Most importantly, and I could hear the excitement he couldn't contain, he said, "Alice, you don't understand. She gets my entrepreneurial vision. She told me I'm bound to succeed." She had several offers from Fortune 500 companies, but she still chose to come to my company. At that moment, he seemed genuinely happy. He said, "She's going to be my right-hand assistant." I just smiled and watched him silently, saying nothing. I think he must have forgotten that when he first started his business, and everyone called him a fraud, I was the one by his side, cheering him on. I believed in his success, even when he doubted himself sometimes. I never once wavered in my belief in him. I never imagined that from that moment on, Rebecca's name would become a constant presence in our lives, turning into a nightmare I would dare not even dream about. Chapter 8. The first time I came face to face with Rebecca was also 7 years ago. Back when Joshua's Peak Tech hadn't yet moved into its own building, there were just over a dozen people crammed into a small office in the tech park. One evening, when it was pouring rain, I went to pick up Joshua after work. At the office, his college roommate, Eric, who had started the business with him, laughed heartily and said, "Sister-in-law, hold on, Joshua's in a meeting." I nodded, then looked through the glass outside the meeting room. Inside were 6 or 7 people. Joshua was writing a series of complex formulas on a blackboard, and the science nerds were arguing heatedly, faces red with frustration, unable to agree on a technical calculation. That's when I noticed Rebecca. She stood calmly beside Joshua, smiling, and added a line to the formula on the blackboard. The room, once filled with noisy debate, fell into sudden silence. In that silence, I saw Joshua look down at her and smile. It was such a perfect understanding between them. When Joshua came out of the meeting and saw me, he looked pleasantly surprised. He glanced outside at the torrential rain, the wind howling, and asked, "In this kind of rain, why did you come?" I didn't answer. My gaze slipped past his shoulder and landed on Rebecca. She stood there, her lips curled into a soft smile, calm and poised under my scrutiny, while subtly observing me as well. I think it's an instinct only women understand. Her presence was intrusive, blatantly so. I smiled back at her and said softly, "Hello, I'm Alice, Joshua's girlfriend." She smiled too and said, "I'm Rebecca, Joshua's assistant." Our first confrontation was wordless. Joshua, standing next to me, was completely oblivious, concerned only about me braving the rain to pick him up. He looked down at me with tenderness and asked what I wanted for dinner. In that silent exchange, I had one. Chapter 9. Of course, looking back now, all of that seems meaningless. Over the years, in my battles with Rebecca, I've had victories and defeats. By now, It's hard to say who truly won or lost. After thinking it through, I can only laugh at myself. Even I grew tired eventually. I didn't want to keep getting caught up between them. So, I asked for a divorce. The night I told Joshua I wanted a divorce was an ordinary evening. I stood on the balcony, watching the sunset fade behind the overlapping skyscrapers in the distance. And then I sent Joshua a message. Joshua, let's get a divorce. He didn't respond for a long time. Probably because he was busy. Hours later, he finally replied with a brief. I stared at the phone screen, thinking for a while, but I didn't reply. That night, Joshua probably noticed I hadn't responded and decided to call me directly. We shared a mutual silence. He didn't ask for a reason for the divorce, nor did he try to stop me. After a long while, he simply said, I'll have the lawyer draft the divorce agreement. I responded with a simple and hung up. I don't know why, but I suddenly remembered our university days. Back then, the dorms had an 11 p.m. curfew, and whenever we talked on the phone, we could go on for hours, as if we never ran out of things to say. But now, we had nothing left to talk about. Shortly after that phone call, he got into a car accident while rushing to celebrate Rebecca's birthday. It was as if even fate couldn't stand it anymore and decided to step in on my behalf. Chapter 10. Joshua, Rebecca, and I had been tangled up for far too long. I don't think Joshua ever imagined I would one day figure things out and ask him for a divorce. The moment I brought it up, he must have felt relieved, because, knowing Joshua's character, bound by that damned sense of responsibility, even though he and Rebecca were deeply in love, he would never have been the one to ask for a divorce. The day I asked for the divorce wasn't marked by anything special. It was just that Sam's homeroom teacher called, asking me to come to the school because he had gotten into another fight with a classmate. When I arrived, Sam and a chubby boy were standing against the wall. The other boy's father had already arrived. He was big, burly, and intimidating, glaring at me as he said, "What kind of parent are you? Look at what your kid did." Sam looked up at me briefly. He was covered in grass and dirt, his face smeared with dust, stubbornly staring at me without saying a word. I walked over, squatted down beside him, and quietly wiped the dirt off his face with my thumb, whispering, "Why were you fighting?" He pressed his lips together, refusing to speak. The other boy's father, frustrated by my lack of response, pushed my shoulder forcefully from behind. I wasn't prepared and fell forward. Before I could get back up, Sam, silent as a little beast, shot forward and bit down on the man's leg. The teacher screamed, and chaos erupted in the office. By the time we left the school, the neon lights had just begun to flicker on. Both Sam and I were disheveled, and I held his hand as I pointed to a store window and asked, "Do you want some ice cream?" He stared at his feet and nodded. Kids are easy to cheer up. By the time we were driving home, his mood had improved, but just before we arrived, he asked me, "Mom, where's Dad?" His eyes were slightly red. I knew he had been wrong today. Sam rarely cried. He was incredibly stubborn for someone so young, but when I had to apologize to that big, burly man in the office, Sam had stood by and suddenly burst into tears. Even though he and Joshua weren't particularly close, I knew he was thinking, if only Dad were here. It was the other kid who started the fight. If Dad were here, Mom wouldn't have been bullied or hit, and she wouldn't have had to apologize. The teacher wouldn't have scolded me either. I gripped the steering wheel, not sure what to say. Since Sam was born, Joshua had barely spent half a month in total with him. It was at that moment that I suddenly felt weary and thought, enough. But these feelings were impossible to explain to Joshua, who was still mentally stuck 8 years in the past, and I didn't want to waste any more words with him. I looked at Joshua coldly and said, "You have countless ways to figure out what's going on. You just refuse to believe it." Chapter 11. Joshua continued to sit at my doorstep. The early autumn weather had grown chilly, and he had not yet fully recovered from his illness. He was much thinner, stubbornly sitting there in his thin hospital gown without moving. I glanced at him through the window, finding it somewhat amusing, because countless times when I wanted to see him, I could only wait like this outside his secretary's office. Eventually, his secretary would come over with a strained smile and ask me to leave. "Mrs. Sue, the boss is busy, and you didn't make an appointment." After that, whenever I needed to see him, I had to call his secretary to schedule an appointment and find a time when he was available. And after a while, I just stopped trying altogether. I turned my gaze away, letting him sit out there in the cold. Later, after helping Sam with his homework, I looked up and saw that Joshua had collapsed on the steps. He had probably passed out. I thought for a moment and called his assistant. The assistant quickly arrived with an ambulance. After they left, it wasn't long before Joshua's mother came knocking at my door. I could refuse Joshua and Rebecca, but I couldn't ignore an elder. Back when Joshua first started his business, I was the ideal daughter-in-law in her eyes. At that time, Joshua wasn't making much money, and whenever we visited her, she would hold my hand with a kind expression, saying, "Good child. You've been through so much. Having you by Joshua's side is a blessing for our Sioux family. If Joshua ever dares to bully you, you just come and tell me." But as Joshua's career took off, she started to change. With a subtle smile, she once said to me, "Alice, it's not that I don't care about you, but Rebecca is simply a better match for Joshua. You understand a mother's intentions, don't you?" Rebecca had a better family background, education, and appearance. A bird seeks the best tree to perch on, as they say. I couldn't fault Sue's mother for her coldness, but it also meant I couldn't sit and have tea with her without any resentment. She wasn't comfortable either. After a few pleasantries, she got straight to the point. "Alice, you're a good child, and I know you and Joshua are in the middle of a divorce, but you also know Joshua's current condition. To be honest, if it weren't necessary, I wouldn't trouble you, but Joshua only recognizes you right now. He fainted again, and the doctor says he mustn't be stressed. It's better for his recovery if we go along with his wishes. I hope after he's discharged, you can take care of him a bit more. His memory loss isn't permanent. Once he regains his memories from the past 8 years, everything will be fine." Her request was perfectly polite, but it would have been more effective without the final veiled threat, you know. Originally, we weren't planning to fight you for custody of Sam after the divorce. Of course, they hadn't planned on fighting me for custody. She was just waiting for Rebecca to give her a grandson with better genes. Now, her words made it clear that they would use Sam's custody to pressure me into compliance. I gritted my teeth, but the only thing I'd learned over the years was that, no matter what I faced, I had to keep smiling. So, I smiled faintly and said, "I'll take good care of Joshua." Chapter 12. The day Joshua was discharged from the hospital, I went to pick him up. Rebecca stood outside the room, her eyes red and swollen, because Joshua had grown impatient with her presence, refusing to let her near, having lost the memories forged over time. Joshua, with the moral values he held 8 years ago, despised the version of himself who had strayed and fallen for someone else. He couldn't understand how he had become such a scumbag. So, he loathed Rebecca. Rebecca glanced at me with tear-filled eyes and gave me a sharp glare, then warned me, "Alice, don't get too comfortable. He's only forgotten me for now. He'll remember eventually." I glanced at her indifferently and said nothing. I had never felt any sense of triumph, only a burden. When I pushed open the door, Joshua was sitting on the hospital bed, giving instructions to his assistant. His expression remained cold and distant while handling business matters, a look I had become all too familiar with over the past few years. He heard the door and looked up. When he saw me, a faint smile began to creep into his usually cold eyes. But my distant demeanor must have put him off, because the smile faded from his lips. He looked somewhat disappointed. It made sense. In his memory, this was the time when I had been cheerfully by his side, enduring hardship with him in the basement apartment. Back then, he'd even pushed the tiny portions of vegetables and meat from our fried noodles onto my plate. We faced the difficulties together, and I was his strongest support. The current reality, with such a stark contrast, must have been hard for him to accept. Forcing himself to muster some energy, he smiled again. The formidable Mr. Sioux of Peak Tech spoke in a tone that could almost be described as ingratiating. "Alice, you came to pick me up." I didn't respond. I knew he was trying to play the emotional card. On the way home, with his assistant driving us, Joshua kept trying to find something to talk about. He said, "Alice, it seems like every time I'm at my lowest, you're the one who picks me up." When he graduated from college and got drunk at the farewell dinner with his roommates. When he bled from his stomach after drinking excessively with investors and clients during his startup days. And when he was hospitalized, and I stayed by his side day and night. He had countless moments of vulnerability, and I had stood by him through many quiet, nameless nights, listening to his drunken rambles about his dreams and ambitions. Back then, I sat quietly by his side with a smile, firmly believing that all the grand visions he described would come true. Then, when he finally emerged from his darkest moments, he gave his best years to Rebecca. So, recalling the past didn't stir any emotions in me. It only made me feel more disgusted and humiliated, like that naive version of Alice who had believed in him was being dissected and put on display for everyone to mock. I felt suffocated, struggling to breathe. I cut Joshua off, and I'm sure the disgust and disdain in my eyes must have hurt him. But I couldn't help it. I forced myself to speak as calmly as I could. Joshua, I know you've forgotten the last 8 years. But that doesn't mean the hurt I've suffered over those years isn't real. I can't just put everything aside and reminisce about the past with you. If you really want to do something good, stop using our past to hurt me. He was stunned for a moment, then fell silent. After a long time, I finally heard a soft apology. His eyes were red as he said, "I'm sorry." I let out a bitter laugh. Chapter 13. I agreed to take care of Joshua solely because of Sam's custody. The doctor said that Joshua shouldn't be provoked, so I treated him like he wasn't even there. When we got home, Sam was working on his homework. I dumped Joshua in the living room and went to the kitchen. When I came out, I saw Joshua standing awkwardly behind Sam, probably trying to see if he could help with the homework to close the distance between them. But Sam had always done well in school, never needing my help. So Joshua looked at the homework for a while before smiling awkwardly and saying, "This kid is really smart." After saying that, he raised his hand to pat Sam on the head. Sam, however, tilted his head slightly to avoid the touch, then silently looked up at Joshua before running over to me, asking, "Mom, is there anything I can help with?" I glanced back, seeing Joshua's hand frozen in midair. After a long pause, his fingers curled slightly as he lowered his hand, looking strangely dejected. I had always hoped that Sam would grow up in a healthy family. I never wanted our adult issues to affect him, but never assume children don't understand what's going on. They're the most sensitive to their parents' relationship. Sam was distant from Joshua, and there was nothing I could do about it. Chapter 14. There wasn't a bed in the house for Joshua to sleep in. He probably understood that he wasn't welcome, so he suggested sleeping in the living room. When I got up for water during the night, I saw him watching something on the projector in the living room. The room was dark, and the projector was on mute, casting flickering images across his face. He looked deeply focused. I walked closer and realized he was watching our wedding video. The projection was large, playing the part where we exchanged vows. I remember that moment. The officiant had asked Joshua and me to say our vows, and I leaned close to whisper in his ear. His eyes turned red. Everyone teased us, thinking I had said something deeply romantic, but only the two of us knew what I had really said. "Joshua, we'll be stuck in this marriage. You've wronged me, and I will never let you off the hook. You'll never be able to walk away and be with Rebecca openly and rightfully. I want the two of you to always remain in the shadows, like rats scurrying through the dark, always stealing moments in places where light never touches." It's such a shame. Joshua and I had been together since sophomore year. While I always talk about my sacrifices, love is a mutual effort. It only works when both sides are giving. Joshua was patient and accommodating. He would wait downstairs while I slowly did my makeup. He'd buy me breakfast every morning. He would always fulfill my wishes. I remember one year, my parents were fighting and nearly divorced over New Year's, and I cried to him over WeChat. The next day, he crossed half the country to appear in front of me, telling me not to cry. In our final year, I had a sudden appendicitis. He was busy with his thesis, but he stayed in the hospital with me from beginning to end. After the surgery, he took care of me. He had severe cleanliness habits, but during that time, he even washed my socks. There were countless moments like these when we were in love. At least at that time, he had never thought of marrying anyone else. He was so sure I was the one for him. Neither of us could have imagined that years later, we'd be standing at our long-awaited wedding, full of tension and resentment, unable to say a kind word to each other. Joshua closed his eyes in pain, pressing his temples hard. I didn't know if he was asking me or himself, but he kept mumbling. How did it come to this, Alice? How did we end up like this? How could I treat you like this? He looked up at me. His face was still handsome, but his brow was furrowed deeply in anguish. He clutched his chest, his dark eyes gazing at me with guilt, confusion, and pain all mixed together. Desperately, he asked, I've always wanted to give you the best of everything. Alice, how did it come to this, that I could hurt you so much? I nearly started crying. In all these years of tugging back and forth with Joshua, he had never apologized to me. He had only ever felt sorry for Rebecca, for keeping her in the shadows for so long. But now, as everything returned to the beginning, looking at how it ended, so, you do feel like you owe me after all. He mumbled a lot, and finally, he looked up at me, his voice barely audible as he asked, Do you still love me? I could only watch his pain with cold detachment. Of course, I didn't love him anymore. This wasn't just me trying to be strong. If you had lived through the 8 years I had, you'd understand the mix of resentment and release I feel. Chapter 15. I don't know when the catalyst for Joshua and Rebecca's relationship began. They worked in the same company, shared the same vision, and spent so much time together. It seemed inevitable that they would start to fall for each other. But regardless of how things turned out, at the beginning, I believe Joshua struggled to resist his feelings for her. If we go back 6 years, the clearest evidence was that he started to zone out at home occasionally. One night, his phone buzzed for a long time, and he didn't answer. He just stared at it, lost in thought. I came out of the study, confused, and asked, Aren't you going to answer? He snapped out of it, looked at me, and then, as if it were difficult, he answered in front of me. I don't know what the person on the other end said, but he responded coldly, Sorry, I don't have time. We'll talk about work tomorrow. After hanging up, I asked who it was, and he said it was Rebecca, who had found a technical issue at the company and wanted to discuss it with him. I looked at him steadily. Between adults, there's often an unspoken understanding. Some things don't need to be said aloud. The intentions behind her call were obvious, and I'm sure Joshua felt them, too. But at the time, I believed that Joshua would handle it well. Maybe he admired Rebecca, and maybe he even thought to himself, if only I were single. But I knew that even if he had a faint admiration or attraction toward her, he wouldn't betray me. We had been together for too long. Sure enough, that night, when we went to bed, he pulled me tightly into his arms from behind and said, Alice, the company is finally getting on track. Let's get married by the end of the year. I agreed. He hesitated for a moment, his arm tightening around my waist, then said in a low voice, I'll talk to her soon. He didn't say her name, but we both knew who he meant. I placed my hand over his and sighed. All right. Chapter 16. I don't know how Joshua and Rebecca talked at that time. In fact, I really wanted to ask him, Is your company unable to function without this one employee? But he was negotiating a new round of financing at the time, and any personnel changes might have had a negative impact. Besides, Rebecca was a key figure in the project. After thinking it over, I decided to hold my tongue. I had always been understanding, putting myself in his shoes to think about his difficulties. I never imagined that after he and his team went to City B to meet with the investors, everything would change when he came back. I was supposed to go with him at that time, but just before we were about to leave, Joshua's mother got into a car accident. She broke multiple bones, with the most serious injury being 2 broken ribs that required surgery. Joshua came from a single-parent household, and with his mother severely injured and bedridden, unable to care for herself after surgery, someone needed to take care of her. Hiring a nurse wouldn't have given him full peace of mind. To let him focus on the negotiations, I stayed behind in City A to care for his mother. He led the team in City B for 2 weeks, and I stayed at the hospital for 2 weeks because I didn't want to disturb him, and because I was also busy at the hospital. We only spoke on the phone a few times, each conversation brief, updating him about his mother before hanging up. I was an only child, raised in the palm of my parents' hands, and had been quite sheltered. I was someone who could get lost in my own neighborhood. Yet during that time, I had to register at the hospital, handle the hospitalization procedures, pay the bills, find the right ward and room number for Joshua's mother, and take care of various complex hospital procedures. I fetched water, found a microwave, bought daily necessities, and more. I waited outside the operating room, and after the surgery, I took care of her personal hygiene, massages, and meals. I sat curled up on a chair, keeping my eyes fixed on the heart monitor, afraid to close them for even a moment. When his mother could finally get out of bed and move around, I collapsed in the hospital corridor from exhaustion and low blood sugar. When I woke up after being put on N4 drip, lying on a hospital bed, I saw a picture shared by our mutual friends in a group chat. It was of their celebration party. It looked like another world, full of noise, laughter, and joy. They raised their glasses in celebration. In the photo, Rebecca sat next to Joshua, laughing so hard she fell against him. Joshua turned his head to look at her, a smile on his face, one of genuine happiness. His other hand hovered protectively behind her, as if he was afraid she might laugh too hard and accidentally fall. It was a half embrace, a protective gesture. Chapter 17. I don't know what happened between them in those 2 weeks in City B, but it's not hard to guess the fertile ground where love might have sprouted, working side by side, sharing the same goals, their professional synergy, and enduring the challenges of negotiating with investors together. Maybe it was during late-night work sessions while discussing proposals. Or maybe it was the daily coffee they shared in sync. Perhaps it was the ambiguous atmosphere of their midnight snacks, or the confidence Rebecca exuded when talking about technical algorithms. All these moments combined to give Joshua reasons to fall for her, though it was unethical. As Gustave Le Bon once said in the crowd, in the eternal struggle against reason, emotions never lose. It was about 3 weeks after Joshua returned from City B when I went to the bathroom one day and saw him standing in front of the mirror, practicing over and over. Alice, let's break up. He paused, adjusted his expression, and continued. Alice, I'm sorry. I've fallen for someone else. Alice, I'm sorry. I'll give you shares in the company. I'll compensate you for the lost years of your youth. But I've truly fallen for someone else. Let's break up. Alice. He must have found it ridiculous himself. After repeating the lines a few times, he suddenly punched the mirror. Then I heard him mutter, Joshua, you're insane. I tiptoed away, and then I saw a message from Rebecca to Joshua. She asked, when will you tell her the truth? The longer you drag it out, the worse it is for everyone. During that time, I thought about many things. Of course, I didn't make a scene. Joshua never actually said those breakup lines to me. But even though he didn't, his mother came to talk to me first. By then, Summit Technology had secured billions in its Series B financing. Her tone towards me had changed. It was condescending, as if I was no longer worthy of her son. I don't know if you can understand my anger at that moment. I wasn't lacking in any way. Joshua and I attended the same university, just with different majors. I had supported him all the way, and I had cared for his mother as if she were my own during her hospital stay. And yet, I had come to this, being looked down upon? In most romance novels, someone in my position would recognize their fate and leave voluntarily. But I was young then, reckless in my actions, unwilling to accept the disdain of others, betrayed by a lover after years of devotion. At that moment, I was filled with anger and frustration, and I had only one thought: if I wasn't happy, then neither would anyone else be. Chapter 18. That night, when Joshua came home, I sat quietly on the sofa, looked up at him, and said just one thing. Joshua, I'm pregnant. Didn't you want to break up with me? Didn't your mother want a better daughter-in-law? I wasn't going to let them have their way. Joshua would never let me get rid of the child. Sure enough, he was stunned. After a long moment, he forced a smile, pretending to be pleasantly surprised. Really? I turned my eyes away. I don't know if anyone ever told him he was a terrible actor, but I didn't want to expose him. That's how we got married. Chapter 19. Before the wedding, Rebecca called him, and I was the one who answered. As soon as I picked up, I heard her crying, her sobs clear through the phone. She was crying hysterically, and I believe anyone who heard would feel some pity. She said, "Joshua, in the end, you still chose her." She cried for a long, long time, and finally, I quietly asked from my side of the phone, "Have you cried enough? Joshua is writing the wedding invitations. Should he send you one?" Her sobs stopped abruptly, and then she hung up. Of course, Rebecca got her revenge later. By that time, Joshua and I had completely fallen apart, and we hated each other. One night, when Sam had a high fever, he was calling out for his father in his delirium at the hospital. I called Joshua, but Rebecca answered instead. The moment she picked up, she laughed and said, "What's the rush? Joshua is on the rooftop of the Twin Towers setting off fireworks for me. Should I take a picture and share it with you?" I stood in the hospital corridor, looking out through the window. In the distance, I could see the brilliant fireworks lighting up the sky. It was Valentine's Day. That was the last time I ever called Joshua. Our vengeful marriage brought neither of us any happiness. At first, Joshua tried hard to be a family man again. I don't know what he and Rebecca discussed, but after we got married, Rebecca resigned from the company. It seemed like things could have ended there. But in the week before Rebecca left, her previous chat logs with Joshua were printed and pasted on every wall of Summit Technology. Among them were some rather private photos she had sent to Joshua. There were also large red letters spray painted on the walls that read "Mistress must die." It was because of this that Joshua and I had our final falling out. His eyes were red, the veins on his forehead throbbing as he tried to control his emotions and question me. "Alice, was this necessary? I've already married you as you wanted, and Rebecca has resigned from the company. Did you really need to humiliate her and ruin her reputation?" I had no way to defend myself. At that time, I was pregnant and on the verge of a breakdown every day. If I were the rational and calm Alice of today, the one who no longer loves Joshua, I would have coolly checked the security footage, found the employees hired to paste those chat logs and photos, and brought them before Joshua to reveal who had hired them. But back then, I was desperate and broken. In response to Joshua's questioning, I retorted sharply, if she hadn't seduced someone else's boyfriend, someone else's husband, how could she have been humiliated? She deserved it. Joshua slapped me hard, blurting out, "She never seduced me. It was all me. I couldn't help myself. I was the one at fault. I'm the one who's guilty. I'm the one who changed." With that slap and those words, all the affection we'd built over the years was shattered. After hitting me, he left. During that time, he stayed by Rebecca's side, who was emotionally devastated and severely depressed because of the privacy leak and was apparently on the verge of suicide. Once she fully recovered, they decided to abandon all worldly concerns and fight against all obstacles to be together. I clung to my title as Mrs. Sue to make sure neither of them could ever have what they truly wanted. Chapter 20. Joshua asked me if I still loved him. I could only look him in the eye coldly and calmly and reply, word by word, "I don't love you anymore, Joshua." He sat on the sofa, looking at me, his eyes filled with the sadness I expected. After a long pause, he asked, "Is there even a small chance for us to start over?" I laughed, a bitter, mocking laugh, and looked at him. "Joshua, you're only saying this because you've lost your memory. If you remembered the past 8 years, you wouldn't even want to sit quietly and have this conversation with me." The weight of it all crushed him, and he was so overwhelmed by pain that his face showed no emotion. His face was hidden in the shadows, and after what felt like an eternity, he spoke in a hoarse voice, "I don't believe it, Alice. I don't believe I could stop loving you. I don't believe I could hurt you like that." My heart had long turned to stone, and his words stirred no emotion in me. I replied, "When you remember, you'll owe Rebecca an apology for saying that." Chapter 21. Joshua began awkwardly trying to fit into life 8 years later. He started by trying to win over Sam. I don't know how he managed to set aside his company work, but when I opened my eyes that morning, he had already prepared breakfast. The table was full, with both Western and Chinese options. Very nutritious. He stood by the table, his tall figure looking strangely nervous as he watched me and Sam. I wasn't sure what Sam likes, So I made a little bit of everything. Sam glanced at the breakfast on the table with his wet, round eyes, then looked up at Joshua, then back at me. He said nothing, walked over to the fridge, took out the sandwich I had made for him the night before, and sat down to eat. He didn't touch a single bite of the breakfast Joshua had prepared. Joshua lowered his head, his expression one of deep sadness. I heard him sigh softly. I turned away, pretending I hadn't seen it. That evening, I was late picking up Sam due to a last-minute meeting. When I rushed to the kindergarten, I found that Joshua had already arrived. He stood waiting at the school gate, tall and imposing. Although he had forgotten the last few years, out of habit, he still carried an air of quiet authority, making him stand out in the crowd. Sam, carrying his backpack, was coming out of the school. The traffic at the school gate was chaotic, and although vehicles were not supposed to be allowed, a white car somehow managed to get in, knocking Sam to the ground. Before I could run over, I saw Joshua stride across the street in 2 long steps. He crouched down to check Sam's injuries, asking, "Where does it hurt? Let Daddy take a look." Sam silently watched him as Joshua rolled up his pant leg. Thankfully, it was just a minor scrape. The driver of the white car began cursing, blaming Sam for not looking where he was going. By the time I reached them, Joshua had already stopped the car, holding Sam in his arms. He glared at the driver with a look as sharp as a blade, cold and cutting like icicles in winter. "Get out and apologize," he said. The driver, a burly man, shrank back under Joshua's gaze, muttering an apology. I saw Joshua take a glance at the car's license plate. Back at home, Joshua had his assistant bring over a first aid kit. He knelt down in front of Sam, cradled his leg in his lap, and personally applied antiseptic to the scrape. That night, Sam came to my room, clutching his pillow. He asked, "Mommy, can I sleep with you tonight?" I opened my arms to hug him. He buried his head against me like a small animal, his voice muffled as he asked, "Mommy, is he being so nice to us because he forgot about that woman?" I hummed in response, saying nothing. Then he asked, "When he remembers, will he stop being nice to me?" I didn't know how to answer. Sam's voice was soft as he said, "Then I won't like him. If I like him and then he doesn't want us anymore, I'll be sad." At just 6 years old, I didn't know how he could say such things, or how long he had been thinking them. The tension between his parents had forced him to mature far too early. I hated everything, except for one thing, my impulsive decision to marry. I regretted dragging my child into this unhealthy adult entanglement. I kissed the top of his head and sighed. "Sleep well, my sweet child." Sam snuggled deeper into my arms and fell asleep. When I looked up, I saw that the door hadn't closed all the way. Joshua stood at the doorway, probably having heard everything. His tall figure was stiff, his eyes fixed on us. I could see a thin layer of tears welling up in his eyes. Or maybe it was just my imagination. Chapter 22. Joshua sat on the sofa, speaking in a voice filled with deep self-loathing. "Alice, I really hate myself. Seeing you and Sam like this. I honestly wish I had died that year before I changed." I looked at him, feeling a bit dazed, but I didn't say anything. "It's fine. Once you remember everything, you won't hate yourself anymore." Chapter 23. Perhaps worried about this cohabiting family life Joshua and I had now, Rebecca came over a few times, but Joshua never let her in. His expression was indifferent, his demeanor cold. He showed the same aloofness and distance he reserved for outsiders. He looked down at Rebecca with displeasure, his tone full of irritation, as if she were trespassing. "Don't come here again. I don't know why I ever liked you, and I don't know what happened between us. But for now, don't show up in front of my family." He paused. I recognized that look. It was the same Joshua from 8 years ago, back when we were in school. He had that same protective stance whenever someone bullied me. Even though he himself had become the one to hurt and betray me, he still protected me without changing his expression. He cruelly said to Rebecca, "You knew I had a girlfriend and a family, and yet you still pursued me. I don't know what I saw in you, but I must say, my intelligence and taste were clearly lacking, and frankly, both you and the future version of myself are incredibly foolish." Rebecca's face flushed red, and she started crying in a choked voice. Joshua stood there unmoved, coldly watching her. After that, Rebecca never came back. Sometimes, I would wonder if Joshua remained like this. Would I be willing to forgive and start over with him? I thought long and hard, and the answer was no, because the betrayal of the past 8 years had cut too deep, exhausting all the love I once had for him. Even when he resembled the man he was 8 years ago, all I felt was sighing regret. How had time turned us into this? It was as if, on the road of life, we had started at two diverging paths, met, and walked side by side for a while, only to eventually split and walk further and further apart on our own separate roads. This accident only allowed us to briefly cross paths again, but the wounds between us, even if hidden, were still there. My heart had grown old and weary, no longer stirred by anything. Besides, Joshua wouldn't remain like this forever. He wouldn't stay like this forever. Chapter 24. Joshua's second surgery was 4 months later. In my youth, I had seen many melodramatic romantic dramas where the hero or heroine regains their memory after another car accident. But Joshua's memory returned when they removed a blood clot from his brain that had been pressing on his nerves. Before the surgery, he had asked for my opinion. He said, "Alice, I don't want to have this surgery." I quietly looked at him and said, "Memory loss isn't an excuse to avoid responsibility. Joshua, you may have forgotten, but none of us have. Every path was your choice, and you must be accountable for your decisions." He raised his hand to cover his eyes. "But I don't want to face another version of myself." It wasn't up to him to choose. His assistant came to take him to the hospital. As the car drove away, Sam stood by the window watching. He was so mature for his age that it broke my heart. Only after the car was out of sight did he turn and ask, "Mom, will he come back?" I smiled but said nothing. Whether the surgery went well or not didn't concern me. My life, without his intrusion, had finally returned to its peaceful state. Sam and I lived our routine, as if Joshua had never been a part of it. It wasn't until about 4 or 5 months later that I saw him again. He came to deliver the divorce papers. It was late autumn then. He stood under the plane tree in front of my house, wearing a black coat. I don't know if it was due to the surgery or something else, but he looked terribly thin, almost gaunt, with no color in his face. He silently watched me approach, then handed me the divorce papers. In just a few months, he looked as though he had aged several years. His voice was soft and quiet as he said, "Before coming here, I thought a lot about it. The legal team asked me several times if I really wanted to proceed with the divorce. I hesitated for a week, but in the end, I had them draft it. I imagine that seeing me makes you sick to your stomach by now. Letting you go is the last thing I can do for you." I opened the agreement and skimmed through it. Most of our marital assets were split evenly, and he even gave me half of his shares in Summit Technology. In addition, Sam was given many extra provisions. The division of assets in this divorce agreement was extremely generous, a massive sacrifice on his part. I wondered how his mother and Rebecca could have agreed to this, or perhaps they didn't know at all. I put away the divorce papers and looked at Joshua. He wasn't looking at me, his eyes fixed on the distance, his expression unreadable. He said, "When I woke up after the surgery, those first 2 days were excruciating. Alice, I couldn't understand how we ended up like this." He didn't finish, but I understood. In his youth, Joshua had been ambitious and full of energy. He moved faster and farther away from the past because the future held so much promise for him. On his path to success, I had become nothing more than a burden. But then he lost his memory, returned to the past, and was forced to confront the stark contrast between the person he had once been and the person he had become. He remembered the Joshua who had once been so devoted to me, so certain he would never love anyone else, determined to give me the world, with a heart full of sincerity. But now, 8 years later, Joshua could fully feel the weight of how much he had hurt me, and the painful truth of how easily people change. In this world, the only constant is change itself. Only Joshua could truly understand the regret and sorrow that came with that realization. He had once loved me deeply, hadn't he? But looking at this divorce agreement, I realized that after 8 years, he was finally acknowledging everything in his own way. He was apologizing for the hurt and betrayal he had caused me, The knot of resentment that had been lodged in my heart finally began to unravel. Chapter 25. Joshua had become quieter and more withdrawn. As his business grew larger, so did his sharpness, but now that sharpness seemed to have rusted, leaving him enveloped in a sense of bleakness. There was a certain air of defeat, as if he had given up on himself. He smiled at me and asked, "Can I come by and see Sam regularly from now on?" I didn't respond. He, a little nervous, added, "I'm not asking to fight for custody. He paused and then laughed bitterly. "I just want to fulfill my responsibilities as a father." I nodded slightly and agreed. We sat in silence for a long time. I had nothing to say to him, and he didn't know what to say. From young lovers to strangers, our relationship had deteriorated beyond repair. Finally, he nodded at me, as if afraid to linger too long for fear of seeing the disgust in my eyes again. "I'll go now." Just before leaving, he suddenly turned back and asked, "Alice, is there anything you need me to do?" I looked at him and, without any resentment, smiled softly. It was the kind of gentle, peaceful smile I used to have when we had first started dating in college, free of any sarcasm or bitterness. He looked shocked, almost flattered, as I calmly said, "I'd like you to give me back the Joshua from 8 years ago." Joshua, during your memory loss, I thought about a lot of things. All my unresolved pain and despair have been smoothed over. I think, if you hadn't fallen out of love, if you hadn't been distracted by someone else during our long relationship, you would have been a good husband and a good father, just like you were during your memory loss. I have no demands of you. I only wish you could return the Joshua from 8 years ago. But we both know everything has changed, and there's no going back. You can't become the Joshua from 8 years ago, and I can't be the Alice from 8 years ago either. We should part ways amicably. Our marriage was not dignified, but at least its end has a somewhat dignified conclusion. His expression dimmed little by little as I spoke, and he forced a smile. "I'm the one who wronged you." I smiled but said nothing. I knew that everything we had to say had already been said. From here on, we would walk separate paths. It was over. In the end, we missed our chance. I had finally made peace with the past 8 years. Chapter 26. The next time I ran into Joshua and Rebecca was at the hospital. By then, it had been nearly 5 years since Joshua and I divorced, and he and Rebecca had been married for about a year, giving Rebecca a resolution to the sacrifices she made over the past 8 years. After Joshua and I first divorced, Rebecca came to find me. I looked at her coldly, and with one sentence, I made it impossible for her to speak. I said, "Rebecca, I own half of Joshua's shares, and Sam has a small share too. Why don't you calculate how much Sam and I own together?" I didn't know if Joshua did it on purpose, but since I had custody of Sam, our combined shares were just 1% more than his. That meant, if I wanted, I could take over his precious Summit technology in an instant. He handed over his company to me, and with one move, I could make him lose everything. I didn't know if this was his way of compensating me. Rebecca's face went pale, and I simply looked at her with disgust. "If you don't want me to act, don't ever bother me again." Finally, I smiled and delivered the final blow to her heart. I asked, "Rebecca, how does it feel to be with a man who will always feel guilty about someone else?" Her expression changed dramatically. I had struck a nerve. The pain I endured in my marriage was now being shared by Rebecca and Joshua. What goes around comes around. In the year after my divorce and reconciliation with the past, I met someone at work who was a perfect match as a partner. His name was Ryan. He was calm, composed, and very committed. Even Sam, who was usually quiet and distant, liked him. So, in our 4th year together, we got married. That's how, today, I ran into Joshua and Rebecca in the obstetrics department. At that time, I was 4 months pregnant, and Ryan was with me for my checkup. When we ran into each other, there was no avoiding a greeting. Joshua's gaze moved from my face to my slightly protruding belly, and he paused. I could see the veins standing out on the back of his hand, and his expression was dazed and pained. But after only a few seconds of hesitation, he masked his emotions and said quietly, "Congratulations." I politely thanked him, and seeing the same obstetrics sign behind them, I offered my congratulations in return. Neither of them said anything. Rebecca stood to the side with a cold expression. She had probably just recently become pregnant, as her stomach was still flat and showed no signs of pregnancy. We exchanged polite farewells. Later, in the parking lot, I saw Joshua again, this time with his mother. Rebecca wasn't there, and I overheard bits of their conversation from a distance. After all that careful selection, you end up with a wife who can't even bear children. Why did you marry her in the first place? I've told you before, the daughter of the Sue family likes you. She's a proper lady, comes from a wealthy family, and she's younger and healthier than Rebecca. If you ask me, why bother taking Rebecca to the hospital? Why try to treat her? You might as well divorce her and marry someone else. For the first time, I felt a strange sense of sympathy for Rebecca. In the end, I heard Joshua's voice, full of exhaustion, almost pleading as he said, "Mom, please." Joshua's mother fell silent after that. I didn't listen any further. Ryan gently helped me into the car. Ever since I got pregnant, he had been treating me like a fragile porcelain doll, caring for me with the utmost caution. I couldn't help but smile at his fussing, but I let him be. Once in the car, he started driving, chatting away in my ear. "What do you feel like eating tonight? I saw you really enjoyed the fish yesterday. Do you want it again today? But maybe eating the same thing 2 days in a row isn't good. I noticed Sam likes spicy food. How about I make a hot pot for you too?" I leaned back into the soft seat, smiling as I listened to his rambling. This was my new, peaceful life, filled with the warmth and simplicity of the everyday. Life hadn't treated me unfairly after all. From here on out, I would make the most of my time and find happiness.